All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to today's CGI Brown Bag webinar series on the role of GIS in organizations and strategic planning. My name is Steve Steinberg. I'm the Geographic Information Officer from the County of Los Angeles and a CGI board member, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This is the third in our series of webinars prompted by CGIA's focus on advocating for GIS as a profession in the state of California. And it's our hope that this serves as a way to enhance the shared best practices, ideas, and experiences across all GIS users and stakeholders. I just want to take a moment to point you to CGIA's website, cgia.org, and highlight just briefly our mission. CGI's mission is to promote the effective use of GIS in California through a variety of means. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but some key ones that relate to our webinar series, such as today, is to support and promote the practice of GIS, to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and information, certainly what webinars are helping with, and also to monitor developments in the field of GIS, including GIS-related policies, which is really part of today's focus, and informing the membership of those activities. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with CGI, visit the website. You can learn more about the organization and what we're doing and join up. I also want to just let you know that before we get to today's presentation, we have one more presentation in this series that we'll be doing on Wednesday, May 13th. That will be with Jim Sparks, the Director of Geoinformatics at the Polis Center in Indiana and former GIO of the state of Indiana, and then Christina Boggs-Chavera, who's from the California DWR at the state here locally. Many of you may know her. So if you haven't already registered for that next webinar, again, you can go to the CGIA website and look at the events, and there will be a link, much like there was for this one, where you can register for that next webinar on May 13th. And we hope to see you all there, and bring a friend. So today's discussion is looking at the Geospatial Data Act and its impacts at the federal, state, and local levels. And as we get into that, let me first just give you a little bit of background on our presenters today. We have two great presenters, Miss Amy Nelson, who's representing the federal perspective, I guess you'd say. Amy is with the Department of Transportation and manages their geospatial response during disasters, as well as leading DOT's implementation of federal geospatial regulations and guidance, including the Geospatial Data Act. She's the lead author of USDOT's GIS Strategic Plan and manages USDOT's geospatial community and assists with the National Address Database and Work Zone Data Exchange projects. Amy has 15 years of experience in the federal government, including 13 years as the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Administration's GIS manager. She holds a BA in Geography from the University of Mary Washington and a Master's of Arts in GIS from Clark University. Our second panelist today is Mr. Cy Smith. He's the GIO for the state of Oregon. And Cy joined the state of Oregon in 2000 as the state GIS coordinator. He's a member of the FGDC's National Geospatial Advisory Committee. Cy is also a past president of the National States Geographic Information Council, a past president of the Urban Regional Information Systems Association, or URISA, which hosts our CalGIS conference every year at the state level along with CGIA, and is the founding chair of the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations, a coalition of 14 geospatial professional organizations representing over 170,000 members. Some of you may know that as COGO. And Cy was manager of GIS for the city of Olathe, Kansas for 4 years, and then Kansas State GIS coordinator for 3 years, and as a GIS consultant with Plan Graphics Incorporated for 4 years before moving to Oregon. So I think between Cy's local and state government experience and Amy's federal experience, we've got a really good perspective and lots of experience around these topics for today. Just before we get started with the presentation, I want to let those of you participating today know if you do have questions during the presentation, if you could please type those into the chat room. We'll try to keep track of those as we go, and then I will try to summarize common questions and bring those up to our speakers at the end of the presentation. So if you don't see the chat button on your Zoom screen, it may be hidden under the More button, the 3 dots, and there should be a chat box where you can post a chat to the chat window as we go. So with that, I will hand it over to Cy and Amy. As I'm changing to the slide deck, I would ask also that if you've got video on, we're going to go ahead and turn off video just to save some bandwidth, not because we don't want you to see us. So we'll get going here. Okay, so with that, we'll turn it over to Cy and Amy.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, I'm glad we got the video for a few minutes there because I put a jacket on for you folks. Hopefully that is causing many of you to smile knowingly. I haven't had a jacket on for about a month and a half as I've been working from home, as has most everybody else, I'm sure, on this call. So we're going to talk, Amy and I are going to talk a little bit about the Geospatial Data Act, origins, requirements, implementation, and partnerships. And I will just tell you from my perspective that there is a lot happening at the I see Jane appreciates the jacket. Thank you, Jane. There's a lot happening with the Geospatial Data Act in terms of implementation, and it's really encouraging to me as somebody in state government to see that, but hopefully it'll be encouraging to you all as well. So Steve, if you want to advance. So the Geospatial Data Act, I've got this header at the top of quite a few of the slides, so you'll be able to, you don't have to jot that down too quickly. It'll come up on the next slide too, but it was House Resolution 302, Public Law 115-254. It is kind of buried in the reauthorization of the FAA program. So that's how these things happen, and it's further buried within a thing that was already being buried in the FAA reauthorization. So we had to get it through, and that's how it worked. So it's a little difficult to find, but hopefully you'll be able to come up with it. The best way to find it really is to go to fgdc.gov/GDA. It's posted there. The reference is there if you want to go actually look at it, but the full text of the document is there as well, or the act. As most of you know, I don't need to necessarily read these things to you, but the NSDI was initiated by executive order in 1993, and the framework data themes were identified in 1994. 26 years after that, we're still not done. Maybe we'll never be done, but we're not anywhere near where we really need to be with the NSDI, and that's not anybody's fault per se. There are some structural issues and some other problems in developing an NSDI for the US that make it a little different maybe than some other places, but there are things that we could do better. And the Geospatial Data Act was an effort toward resolving one of the key issues, which is governance. How do we make decisions collectively about a national spatial data infrastructure when we don't all report to the same public body, we don't all report to the same company, we don't have the same bosses. We're a federation, and we have many bosses that we have to report to. So how do we make decisions together about something like this? We don't have a structure for that. We've had a structure that was in executive order, but now we have a structure that is in statute. So that makes it better. It makes it apply to everyone, as opposed to an executive order, which really applies to the executive branch of the federal government. But it's still not enough. So there's more to be done, but it was a good start, and we did as much as we could. I've had many people ask me, well, why didn't you put the governance structure in that would make this work into the bill? Well, if you knew the background of the bill, you would know that we were really lucky to get what we got. So let's go to the next slide. Senator Hatch this really came out of his office. I worked with his staff pretty closely on pieces of this. They had been working on it before I got involved in it for several years, actually. And Senator Warner from Virginia was another co-sponsor of the bill on the Senate side. On the House side, Representatives Westerman from, it should say Arkansas, it's a misprint, Republican from Arkansas, and Representative Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts, co-sponsored the original bill on the House side. And it's all about improving the coordination and use of geospatial data. Senator Hatch ultimately, as he was retiring, most of you know that Senator Hatch has retired from the US Senate in 2018. As he was retiring at the end of that Congress, he really pulled and dragged this bill across the finish line by calling in a lot of personal favors and so on. It's really tough to get even a bipartisan bill through the Congress. So the President pro tem of the United States Senate had to call in favors to get this thing through as it was. If we had tried to do more with it, we just wouldn't have gotten it. It was supported by a lot of geospatial organizations, including ERISA, NISGIC, which is the National States Geographic Information Council that Steve mentioned, and the International Association of Assessing Officers, which a lot of county assessors will recognize, and that's their organization. And it was supported by many private sector geospatial companies as well. Let's go to the next slide. These are the key elements. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of what's in the bill, just so that what's in the act, just so you get a flavor of what's in there. There's a lot there, and as you'll see as you go through it, there's if you read through the language, there's more than you're going to see in these slides, but these are the highlights. So in terms of governance structure, it designates the Federal Geographic Data Committee as the lead entity in the executive branch, and it empowers the FGDC to designate data themes and direct and facilitate the national implementation of those themes. It empowers the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, which is a Federal Advisory Committee Act committee advising the FGDC on the Geospatial Data Act. It empowers NGAC to advise the FGDC on the Geospatial Data Act. NGAC provides lots of other advice. They've been in place since 2008. This act empowers them to do more and tells FGDC, you need to pay attention to what they're advising you on in a more significant way, perhaps. So there's some additional sort of powers for the NGAC. And it establishes principles for the NSDI, and these are pretty important. It ensures privacy and security of the personal data of individuals. It ensures free access of the data to the public. It protects the proprietary interests related to licensed information, and it supports and advances the establishment of a GSDI, Global Spatial Data Infrastructure. Next. A little bit more about what it does. It talks about the development of the National Geospatial Data Assets data themes. So those originally in 1993 and 1994, framework data sets were established. Since then, there have been additional National Geospatial Data Assets that have been established and recognized as themes that we should build as a nation as part of the NSDI and share beyond just the original 7 or 8 framework data themes. So the bill ensures coordinated management of all of those assets. It provides leadership and facilitates development by the FGDC for data standards, for the development and implementation of a plan, for population of the data themes, and it calls for developing partnerships. So this is a really key point. Developing partnerships with states, tribes, higher education, private sector, other federal agencies, and local governments to build and maintain the NSDI. The bill talks about that repeatedly, or the act, I keep calling it a bill. The act talks about that repeatedly throughout. It talks about geospatial data standards in one of the sections and directs the establishment of standards for each data theme and associated metadata, which of course we're already doing, but now it's in statute. So that's a really good thing. Developing and promulgating the standards and excluding data that could harm the national interest, security, or defense. So there were some things that were excluded from this bill, and we did that partly as a concession to to DOD and a few other organizations that said, hey, look, if you want us to not fight this, you're going to need to exclude some things. Otherwise, we're going to have some serious problems with the language, and it's going to drag on while we try to make sure that the language is something that isn't going to harm the national interest. And then it also establishes the idea of a geo platform, which again, we're already doing, but the idea of the FGDC operating a service for the public and others to access geospatial data and metadata. Let's go to the next slide. Section 759 of the Geospatial Data Act. Oh, is this, Amy, is this your slide?
Yeah, I'll
okay, sorry. Very good.
No
I couldn't remember where I stopped.
No worries, I was going to stop you anyway. Thanks for that overview, Si.
Sure.
And I'm here to talk about how the Geospatial Data Act is being implemented by federal agencies and its impacts on us. So one of the biggest sections that we're looking at is Section 759, which talks about reporting requirements for covered agencies. Note that not all federal agencies are covered agencies. There's also a disconnect between federal agencies that may have covered data sets, but the agency itself is not covered. So basically, everyone is trying to meet together, pool their resources, and work out how to comply with these requirements. However, we're still awaiting guidance from OMB. We expected that a year after the Geospatial Data Act. It will clarify things such as the definition of geospatial data. As you guys probably know, there's a lot of questions that can be rolled into that. Is data whose native format is tabular but contains things like lat longs? Is that geospatial data? There's all kinds of twists and turns here. So we hope to see that clarification soon. We've been told they're working on it, but it's not ready yet. And it will be an update to Circular A16 when it is presented to us. The bottom line reporting requirements for this section are 2 reports that are due annually. One is to the FGDC, the Federal Geospatial Data Committee, and one is to Congress. And additionally, there's biennial audits that are required by the agency OIGs, which is the Office of the Inspector General. And a note on that OMB clarification, we've been told we need to move forward even in the absence of the clarification. So these reports and these audits are not waiting. They're happening right now. The preparation for the reports and the audits are already in progress. Next slide, please. I'm just going to run through some of the responsibilities of these covered agencies. The first one deals with a strategy or a strategic plan, as we interpret it, about how we're going to use geospatial data at the agency level. And the second one is talking about how we're going to share geospatial data with federal and non-federal users. There's a big emphasis on data being shareable. There's also an emphasis on allocating resources to meet these requirements and maintain, collect, produce our geospatial data. We are working, as Si said, in partnership. If you can just go back to the previous slide, please, thank you. As Si talked about the partnerships, and yes, that's extremely important. And in this aspect, we're looking at how to maintain, disseminate, preserve the geospatial data, working with these partners. At DOT especially, we're an agency that doesn't produce a lot of our own geospatial data, but we are really good at collecting it from other states, industries in some cases, and taking a bunch of disparate data sets, cleaning them, standardizing them, and disseminating it. A good example is the federal highways data that comes from the states. Another example is pipeline data. Now that's protected, so you all probably are not that familiar with it. But that comes from about 1,500 different pipeline operators. So that's an example of industry data sets, which are all quality controlled, inspected, and then put together into one nationwide data set. The last point here is talking about basically kind of being a good steward of federal funds. And most agencies have been doing this really probably since the dawn of the Geo platform to see if existing geospatial data exists before we spend money on new geospatial data. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of working groups going on here. When the Geospatial Data Act first came out, representatives from each agency, covered or not, really, because the non-covered agencies don't know if they might become covered agencies when this revision to Circular A16 comes out. It's possible. So we all had a big Tiger team meeting and split into working groups. Here's a couple of the very active working groups. I'm on the reporting requirements working group. Tony Lavoie from USGS is my co-lead there. There's a group dealing with communications, reaching the agencies, letting them know what's required. And there's very important work being done by the standards group. So that's really developing or implementing standards that already exist for certain geospatial data sets. That's a long road because not only does every existing standard need to be examined to see if it would meet our needs, once a standard is agreed upon, the FGDC must vote on it and adopt it. And after that point, agencies really have 5 years to bring their data into that standard before any penalties arise. Cy talked about the NSDI, and the NSDI strategic plan is a very key document to all of this. So it's really going to dictate the agencies like Department of Transportation's own strategic plan. And so we're kind of playing a timing game here, where right now the NSDI core team is working on their plan. We expect them to release it in right around the turn of the fiscal year, which is October 1st here. However, we'll probably see a draft internally before then. So I expect, as the author of DOT's strategic plan in the summer, which is right around the corner, I'll be able to see enough to know to start my own strategic plan. But basically, we have a short window between when the NSDI plan is finalized and when the agency's strategic plans are due, which is at the end of December 2020. Cy also, I believe, talked about the NGAC, which is the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. So here's a role that was formalized in the GDA and then happened throughout the GDA. Various committees that already exist, their role was just kind of formalized and put into code here. Next slide, please. One key document that we've been working on is a roadmap. And that's really just talking about how we're doing these things together as a combined federal team and what the standard would be for success or for compliance, right? So agencies need to know really what the barrier is to all of these requirements and what the expectations are. We are highlighting tasks that are on track, behind schedule, or there's some problem with them. And we found this useful as sort of a project management tool, as well as a way to communicate to the agencies what is needed. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just really more on the roadmap, how we're taking a whole FGDC approach to developing the roadmap. We're meeting weekly, we're meeting across many agencies, and we're just kind of dividing and conquering on some of the tasks, but we're all giving feedback to each other on how we interpret various guidelines and requirements, which has kind of evolved over time as we talk about them more and mull them over more. We've come to some realizations that we didn't have at first about what the requirements actually mean. We intend for the roadmap to evolve over time, and certainly if more guidance comes out from OMB and these audits come to a close, that will help us explain to agencies how to comply with the requirements going forward. Next slide, please. We don't have a dedicated project management office. The working group should not be mistaken for such. And the roadmap shouldn't be mistaken for an integrated project plan. We do have one big issue, which is there are no resources specifically allocated for GDA compliance. So what, in our ideal world, what we would have is a Geospatial Data Act PMO, and that could provide support to all the covered agencies and the NGDA theme leads. Of course, it's also an issue at the agency level where there is no budget set aside for complying with the Geospatial Data Act. That's pretty common these days, that there are mandates with the agency needs to find their own resources to meet. Next slide, please. I spoke about the audits, and what's happening right now across the federal agencies is they're basically starting their data call this month. We expect that they will wind up the interviews and the data collection by June because their audits are due the first week in October. We've been told by the IG Council that they're planning a readiness review instead of a full audit this first time, because we haven't even submitted the first FGDC reports or the congressional reports yet. There's a lot of things that are still outstanding, and they did think it would be a mistake to conduct a traditional audit at this point. But since the audits are going to take place every 2 years, we expect in 2022 the audit will be a different situation. And just 2 more examples of why a full audit isn't possible. As I mentioned, the agency strategic plans have to follow the NSDI strategic plan. If this data collection only lasts until June, there's no agency strategic plans that will be done by then. That is a requirement. They're going to be done in December, just not by the end of the audit. And likewise with the geospatial data standards, as I mentioned, those are years most likely from completion and adoption. So that's something that's not possible to audit fully yet. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk briefly about how we're implementing it specific to DOT. So DOT is a covered agency, and we also have one NGDA, National Geospatial Data Asset theme. That's the transportation theme that belongs to us. And we co-lead the address theme with the US Census. So there's another section, section 756, that has all sorts of requirements for NGDA theme leads. Those are things like developing a way to promulgate the theme, to find standards that fit the theme. There is a long list of requirements when you lead NGDA theme. Switching gears, how are we going to report to the FGC and to Congress? Wouldn't it be great if all the agencies reported in the same way, and that the FGDC could easily roll up all the agency reports? So that's another project in its own right. Just this morning, I was meeting with a group that is developing reporting templates that the agencies will use to report their progress to the FGDC. And again, we're taking the language in the Act and changing it into sort of survey questions and defining the different categories of compliance. So that's also a big project. Bringing it back down to the DOT level, we have some issues in my agency with tracking our geospatial spending. There is no accounting code that identifies geospatial contracts. We see some contracts that are IT contracts, but we also have some that are architecture and engineering contracts that have a significant spending on geospatial data or support. So the way that my supervisor, the GIO, and I are handling that is we really just have to rely upon our contacts in the different divisions of DOT to know what they're doing geospatially, and then to chase down the contracts that are part of that. Additionally, the budget requests, as I mentioned, there is no money currently allocated, but that is one thing that we have been asked to do, is have a budget request for geospatial going forward. So writing something into an agency budget is also can be a big undertaking. The third one is just my own pain point, that 3 major deliverables are all due on New Year's Eve. And I thought I had learned my lesson in my previous job about having deliverables due that last week in December. It's not up to me, but unfortunately, these are all due at the same time in a month that is a difficult month at best here. Now at DOT, as I mentioned, we have these different operating administrations. We call them modes, as in modes of transportation. And they're required to abide by our existing policies. So there's a requirement in the GDA about the NARA records scheduling, as in, records that must be scheduled. So they're required to abide by that policy, and that should cover all of the agencies. But me and the GIO do not have centralized control over what they're doing. So we have to talk to them and make sure they are complying, and it's not something that they report to us. So again, we're having to do some digging to make sure that everyone is abiding by the proper policies, and we can check that box that we're complying. Our audit approach, therefore, that first bullet down at the bottom there, is that if there's a data policy, it covers geospatial data. I'm not sure what it's like at all of your agencies, but I think that, you know, there can be kind of a blind spot knowing that geospatial data is part of data, and data policies also apply to geospatial data. In other words, we don't need our own policy for geospatial if it's already covered somewhere else. And the second point there is explaining to auditors, really going from the bottom up, what geospatial is and what a geospatial data standard means, and why it's not something that's going to be done this fiscal year or this calendar year. I'll turn the next slide over to Sai.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So NGAC, National Geospatial Advisory Committee, has a work group that was established to provide initial advice to FGDC on implementation of the Geospatial Data Act. And we've done a number of things. The work group produced a document evaluating the FGDC analysis of the Geospatial Data Act, saying, all right, well, I mean, the NGAC is state government folks, local government, private sector, academic, tribal, etc. All the various sectors are represented on NGAC. So we were providing that outside perspective on what FGDC and their Tiger team had done in terms of analyzing the Geospatial Data Act and what needed to happen going forward for its implementation. We also amended the bylaws of NGAC. NGAC came into being in 2008, long before the Geospatial Data Act, had some bylaws, and we needed to make some changes to those to reflect the Geospatial Data Act and our involvement in that, and the difference in the NGAC and its sort of authority going forward in statute now. It's one of the few FACA committees that are recognized in statute as having a role. And then we also began assisting on agency reporting to Congress, which Amy mentioned earlier, and agency reporting to FGDC. We started working on that in December of 2019. And that is a really important thing. I mean, Amy said, wouldn't it be nice? Yeah, it would be nice. It is also essential. I mean, the agencies have got to have a template to report consistently. The key thing here is we have to tell a story to Congress about why geospatial data is important. If we want Congress to be engaged beyond just passing a law, we want them to help fund the NSDI and help fund our participation as state government, local government, regional government, tribes, private sector, et cetera. We need help with the funding, in addition to a governance structure where we can all make decisions together about how we're going to build this thing going forward. We need Congress to be engaged in that, obviously. In order to get them engaged, we have to have consistent reporting, and it has to tell a story to Congress about why it's important and what it means. And we can't do that if all the agencies are reporting differently. Part of the reporting is on expenditures, geospatial expenditures as a whole, and then geospatial expenditures in developing the national geospatial data assets. Those expenditure reports have to be accurate. They also have to be consistent. If left to their own devices, one agency might report expenditures in one way and another would report it in another way, and you're not going to get a clear picture of what the true spend is. I've done some work in Oregon probably 10 or 12 years ago on what our expenditures are, and they are significant. In Oregon, we calculated and measured that we spend $1.4 billion. Now that's wrong. We spend $5 billion. I get the numbers mixed up sometimes. We spend $5 billion every year in Oregon state and local government on geospatial data. That's the use of the data, the collection of the data, the management of the data. $5 billion in Oregon, which has 1.3% of the US population, every year in state and local government on geospatial data. If you just roll that up in whatever way you want to roll it up, the number gets really big for the country and state and local government. You figure the feds are probably spending about that much. And then you look at private sector, insurance industry, real estate industry, timber industry, energy industry, et cetera, are all spending money on basically this same kind of data. We could all be focusing that money in a much better way. It's probably something around, if you just do a back of the napkin estimate, somewhere around $2 trillion every year that we spend on NSDI kinds of data in government and the private sector combined. That's real money. I don't care who you are. So Congress would take notice of that, but this is a first step in getting them to take notice, is getting the federal agencies to report it in a consistent way. So it's really, really important. NGAC's been trying to help work on that. And then finally, NGAC will take up stakeholder engagement this summer, and that's going to go back to the piece. I've got one more slide after this. It's going to go back to the piece about we're supposed to develop partnerships to build the NSDI, and stakeholder engagement is a way that we're going to start that. FGDC has engaged the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations in the implementation process of the GDA, and so that's something that Steve mentioned earlier about the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations. It's actually 14 now organizations representing 170,000 members around the country in those various organizations. And so you've got lots of government folks, lots of private sector folks engaged with those organizations, and FGDC is asking for advice from that group that I've been involved with for a long time as well. Go to the next slide, Steve. So stakeholder engagement. This is one of the three places where it's mentioned in the GDA. Basically, this same language in all three places. A little bit of difference, but the idea is here. This was the best place that I could use to point it out. It's one of the final sections of the GDA, 759, and you can read it here. It talks about state, tribal, local governments, higher ed, private sector. The clear intent is to use partnerships to develop and maintain the NSDI. It presents a real opportunity for other sectors to play important roles. So we don't have to do this today. We can if you'd like. If you have some ideas, that would be great. But NGAC is going to be seeking, and FGDC is going to be seeking advice on methods for stakeholder engagement and partnership development. It can get pretty complex. We need to figure out the right way to do this, because the NSDI if we're going to build this, it has to be important for everybody at every level. We're not going to build something that we can all share if it's not important for some of us. So a lot of the data comes from local governments. It comes from county assessors. It comes from county and city planning offices. It comes from county and city public works offices. I know that that's the case in Oregon. I've worked pretty hard to get them really engaged in what we're building. We're building our portion of the NSDI in Oregon, but I don't have all of them engaged in Oregon even. There are going to be lots of holes if we don't get everybody engaged in this. So part of it's governance structure, part of it's funding, part of it is how do we build partnerships so that this is important for everybody. California, I'm just going to make one final pitch here, and then I think we're done and we can get into the discussion and questions and so on. But California is important. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this webinar today was because I recognize that California is important. I think you all know that. I'm not blowing smoke here. California is influential, always has been, always will be. If you're not doing something, that's as influential as if you're doing something. And right now, California has not been playing on the national scene with regard to geospatial data. You're doing great things internally in a lot of different places. Steve's doing great things. There have been great things going on in a lot of different local governments in California. But as a state, you've been pretty absent, I would say. Nobody's fault. I'm not casting blame here. I'm just telling you, now's the time to step up. I know you just hired a new state GIO, Isaac Cabrera, and he's, I think going to do a great job. And I hope that he will really get the state moving and get you guys engaged. But we need California to be engaged in this. For stakeholder engagement and partnership development, you guys could lead the way much more effectively from an influence standpoint than I can do in Oregon, although I definitely want to be a partner with you, and we'll try to do my best at that, at playing that role. So I will stop there. That's my pitch. let's work on this together. I think we're done, Steve.
All right. Well, thank you again, both Cy and Amy, for the great information about the programs and the opportunities and the encouragement for us in California to get involved. And I'll reiterate what Cy just said. We, as of yesterday, have Isaac Cabrera as our new state geographic information officer. So I think we need to give him a little time to settle in, but we can probably, many of us work with him already, have been for years. I think we can, work together in that realm to help push some of these things forward. Again, reminder to folks, if you have questions you'd like to pose, please put them in the chat. But let me just start out with sort of building off that final remark you gave there at the end, Cy, which is, how can we get involved? Like, what mechanisms should people on this call and their colleagues be thinking about as ways to have the kind of influence you're suggesting we should have? Oh, I think both of you are muted, Cy and Amy.
So Steve,
Yes.
I kind of took that as a question for the participants. I mean, if there's some ideas out there, we'd love to hear them. I don't want to fill the space with our ideas necessarily. If we've got some, I know we've got lots of good folks on the phone.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody's got thoughts on that, I know a few of us out here do things on our own, but is there better ways to coordinate through organizations like CGIA and ERISA, for example? While you're pondering that, let me bring up a couple of other questions that have been posed. One question that came was, can you point us to a good document we can see giving details that should be included in statewide budget numbers for GIS? So, Cy, you talked about how you came up with something like $5 billion in Oregon. Where would we go to try and do something similar here, if in our local or state government?
I keep struggling to re-find my mute button. my cursor disappears. What we did this in 2007. I hired a consultant. I spent $500,000. When you think about $500,000 to come up with a $5 billion number, that's a pretty small percentage. So it's well worth it. We did a cost-benefit study. I will happily provide that to you guys so you can see the detail. It is very detailed. There's a spreadsheet that has all kinds of related tabs and so on. But what we did was we took the basic methodology was we looked at about, I think it was 12 state agencies, large, medium, and small. We sat down with them. We had them open their books with us, and we looked at how they accounted for expenditures for geospatial data in terms of collecting it, managing it, and using it. So when I talk about using it, I'm not talking about there's no money in this for the amount of money that you would spend if you're a local government and you're filling potholes. There's no money in there for the truck, for the materials, or the time of the workers to fill the pothole and run over it and flatten it out and all the stuff you do with a pothole. What we had to have them do with local governments, for example, in that example, was we had to have them pull out how much they spent figuring out where the potholes were, mapping them out, and getting the crew to the potholes in an organized way. That's using the geospatial data. So they use the geospatial data in a particular way to do that. It's a portion of the total amount of money they would spend on filling potholes. And then you just look at all the tasks. So state government, we looked at about a dozen. Local governments, I think we looked at about 20. There were, again, large, medium, and small local governments. And then and we sat down with them, had them open it up. People don't track the use of geospatial data in that way. They track how much they spend filling potholes. They don't break it down into, we spent this much money on the data that we needed to do that, and this much money on managing that data so that the next time we did it, we didn't have to recollect it, or we didn't have to start over, that kind of thing. So we had to have them estimate that, but we didn't estimate it. We had them estimate it, and we just guided them on how to do that. And then we extrapolated from there, and we built it all together. That's why we have lots of different tabs on this spreadsheet. We did, there's some additional estimating that we did, and we ended up with a $5 billion number. And then we looked, because it was a cost benefit study, we looked at how much we ultimately came up with a number of how much we were wasting. And because we're duplicating effort across multiple agencies and departments, and we were wasting about 200 million every year at the time in state and local government. But we did not go into federal agencies or anything like that, and half of Oregon is managed by or administered by the federal government. We didn't look at that part in our study.
Great. And Amy, you had mentioned when you were talking about the lack of a budget code for geospatial data, which kind of plays off what Cy just said. Have you seen, or do you have recommendations on ways that, all of us might do a better job tracking, or is there value in trying to have a coding scheme that pulls geospatial out specifically?
I think there's definitely value in coding geospatial spending. Our approach at DOT has been to work with our procurement department to try to put a code in the system. Because as I said, they can be all different types of contracts, and depending upon if the contract representative is familiar with geospatial or not, they may not even understand that geospatial exists in this contract. They may just be calling it data, or it may not be on their radar. So, I'm a fan of these working groups at whatever level. So as I mentioned, we have the cross-agency working group across government agencies, but at DOT, we also have something called the Geospatial Coordination Council, which ideally is leaders from all the different operating administrations, where we can get out messages like this. We also have a separate group for geospatial users, because there's a different set of messages you want to talk to the people who are using the software hands-on about. So it's not a new approach, but it's an approach that I think works for us.
Thanks. That's a good idea, I think, for us all to consider better ways of tracking and promoting what we do and the value of that. Another question from the audience here that's anonymous. If counties are wanting to share and collaborate between them amongst themselves, do we need to wait for the state to get involved, or should we just get going? What are your thoughts on that? That's probably more of a side question at the state level.
Well, you should absolutely just get going. I mean, waiting is definitely not the answer. But again, like Steve was saying, I mean, you've got a new state GIO. You got to give him a little bit of time to get his feet on the ground, get his balance, and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that could be done potentially in terms of coordinating and aligning yourself with the national spatial data infrastructure. I think there's a lot going on. So probably the best thing to do, if you don't already know about it, is to kind of familiarize yourself with what's going on nationally. The ERISA is a good place to also get some additional information about that and help coordinate with that. NISGIC is another place. The National States Geographic Information Council is working on a number of different things that involve local governments. I'm working on a pilot project right now through NISGIC and the Democracy Fund on geospatially enabling elections. And that is involving our county clerks up here. And so there are a whole bunch of things going on and lots of different ways to get engaged. So I'd say move forward, and I'm happy to continue that discussion offline if any of you guys want to email me, and I'll try to help provide some guidance on that too.
Great. Another question from the group here, and I think this could probably go to both Amy and Cy, saying we need a clear, or the equivalent of a clear delegation of responsibility for themes with development, planning, standards, and implementation, and responsibility on delivering on a reasonable timeline. I think the nugget in there is, you know, if we don't want to duplicate data and we want to get timely and accurate data for these shared sort of roles, like you know, like the policies are suggesting, how do we figure out who's responsible for which data sets and make sure they deliver? Do you have thoughts on that at either the federal or state level?
Well, I can see if I can find the list of the NGDA themes and the lead agency. That shouldn't be something that would be hard to find, if that's really what the question is.
Yeah, I think it is. Well, I mean, I know just at the local government level, you know, there's multiple departments within a government that want to use a particular data theme, roads, parcels, land cover, whatever it may be, you know, and often the problem of duplication is everybody does their own version and they don't coordinate or know who's the responsible party. Um, so how is that happening at other states or federal levels?
Well, for Oregon, we have part of our governance structure is a framework implementation team. That was a terminology that was started and a process or methodology that was started early on in the NSDI. I kind of adopted that when I was in Kansas. I brought that to Oregon. So for 20 years, we've had framework implementation teams around different themes of data. It's just part of our governance structure. Those teams are composed of people from all the different stakeholder sectors, and they are the place where you focus work on a particular theme, like transportation or orthoimagery, elevation, parcels, address points, etc. So we have, in Oregon, we have 15 or 16 different teams around 15 or 16 different themes of data, framework data. So that's one way to do it. There are a variety of ways, but you really need that governance structure. I mean, that's what I started this thing with, was talking about governance structure for a reason, because you really have to have that. And I think the state is the right level at which to lead that and then get everyone engaged. You've got to have a place to take those decisions. You make decisions together about a particular data theme, but then you have to have a place to take it in a higher level governance structure. So I think that's probably something that to talk about with Isaac and get him engaged. I also noticed that Jane had brought up the fact, and I don't know why I didn't think to mention this, but of course the California GIS Association is a player in this and can help provide that. You've got work groups already set up around different things. That's another great place to get engaged if you want to start moving forward as a local government, other stakeholders.
All right, oh, that's great. So maybe I'm trying to see, so Jane put the link to the GIS Council on there in the chat for those that might be interested in checking that out more. One other question that, or topic that was brought up in the chat is how do we get more active with our peers in other states? I mean, obviously there's things like NSGIG and the professional organizations. Is there coordination for state and local governments in other venues beyond those that you've mentioned, or ways to connect beyond what we're doing today?
Not that I know about. I mean, there could be. It just kind of depends on what branch of local government you're with. So you've got, if you're with cities, you've got a municipal association. If you're with counties, you've got a county association. Regional governments have their own. I mean, everybody's got their own association. And those are also places that you can go and find, oftentimes, a group within those that is connected with around GIS and around geospatial data, or just around data in general, that's connected with like the county association in neighboring states or the city association in neighboring states. Other than that, I don't know of other ways personally.
Well, yeah, there's also, conferences by theme, such as the GIS for Transportation Conference, which would have been earlier this month. So it depends on what really type of GIS you're doing, not just your sort of level of government.
Okay, great. One of the things that I think you both really addressed along the way in the presentation was the need to raise awareness of the value and importance of geospatial to Congress and at the federal level, and encourage funding and so on. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of ways to engage and encourage that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are to make it very timely. Do you think this whole COVID-19 thing where everyone's got a map in front of them every day looking at how the outbreak is progressing, is an opportunity for us to raise awareness for people who maybe hadn't been looking at maps and geospatial data at that level, or other opportunities we should be taking advantage of?
Absolutely. I think it's very uniquely suited for some great visualization projects, which I've seen. And like you said, they've become kind of the graphics of record for a lot of this. So, you know, although it's a sad situation, it is also an opportunity to show how we can assist with GIS in the response. At DOT, we're doing things like mapping when state stay-at-home orders came into effect and the effect that had on transportation, on numbers of people taking planes, trains, mass transit, and so on. So it's just a way to assist with the response in this case.
You know, I think just to add to that, this is a different disaster than any other that we've had. I just refer to it as a disaster just to bring to mind things like Katrina, where we tried to take advantage of that. You know, you should never let a good disaster go to waste, as they say. And many of us tried to take advantage of multiple kinds of disasters like that to advance the use of GIS, to make it more understood and more important, and so on. It is absolutely becoming ubiquitous as we look at what's happening. Almost every website you go to has got some kind of ArcGIS Online thing going on, or some kind of map going on in real time, an interactive map. We need to take advantage of this one, and we can, I think, because of the difference, maybe a little more effectively. It's something that's affecting everyone at every level, and there are data sharing requests and activities that are going on, sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. I've got a number of complaints that I'm trying to deal with here in Oregon where folks are not sharing data that they should be, you know, for this particular use and purpose. I'm trying to take advantage of this in a way to say, all right, look, here's the good side, and here's what's happening when we're not able to share the data, and let's harden these data sharing approaches that are being successful. Let's institutionalize them going forward. Let's start talking about that now while we're in the middle of this. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's extending for a long period of time. We've got the opportunity, and that's another difference with this, we've got an opportunity to take advantage of this because of the extension of time, to start talking now about how we harden and institutionalize the data sharing approaches that are working in this for geospatial data and for other data. So I think we've got some good opportunities.
Well, great. Well, that is the end of our hour. So I want to thank both Amy and Cy once again for your great presentation and discussion around these topics. I hope that everyone took some value out of this, and we can leverage this as a jumping off point for our own activities at the state and local levels across California. I do want to again remind everyone our next and final webinar in this series will be on Wednesday, May 13th at the lunch hour again. You can visit the CGIA website to register. And as we're looking towards later in the year, if anyone on the call has ideas on topics or speakers they'd like us to look at scheduling going forward, please feel free to email chair@cgia.org. That will go to the board chair, and we'll consider that at board meetings and continue to offer these kinds of educational opportunities. So again, please visit the website for registration or to learn more about the organization. And that concludes today's session. And one final thank you to Amy and Cy, and thanks to everyone for attending. It was a great lunch.
Thank you.
Folks.